It's been a few days, but I am back. I'm back to my top 5 greatest players for each NBA team list. And I'm still a little hyped about my boys, the Philadelphia Eagles, winning the Super Bowl. You get caught up in Super Bowl weekend and other non-YouTube related things going on in my life. But I'm back to this now. Super Bowl's over. I'm going to do my live stream recapping the game later tonight. I'm recording this February 11th in the early afternoon Eastern Standard Time. But with that being said, it's also back to the top 5 greatest players series. In this one, we got the New York Knicks. Now, I find with the Knicks, they're one of the historically storied franchises in NBA history. They've, won a couple championships. They've been to several finals appearances outside of that. Their best years were the early 70s into the 90s. And recently, they're starting to catch up again. 2000s, they weren't that great. 2010s, they had a few good years, but nothing phenomenal. Now, the 2020s, they're starting to find their niche and get back into contention. But so, yeah, they've had a bit of a storied history. And we got a few honorable mentions before we get into the top 5. Let's start with some honorable mentions. We're going to start with one of the guys from those 90s teams. That's Charles Oakley. Charles Oakley played alongside Patrick Ewing. He helped mold the Knicks into contenders, was that second big in that team with Ewing. Now, he wasn't one of the greatest players of all time, but was a pretty good Knick for the time he lasted. Somewhat of an underrated big man. At least worthy of an honorable mention. Another one would be John Starks. He was a bit of a trash talker, could get you some buckets. Now, he was a pretty good role player on those Knicks teams. Not the best player, not one of the best players of all time, not one of the top-tier elite players of his era, but a good player and somewhat of an underrated name, at least worthy of an honorable mention. Another honorable mention, we go late 90s, early 2000s. That's Allen Houston, one of the best three-point shooters of his era, one of the top three-point shooters in New York Knicks franchise history. Bit of a forgotten name and a bit of a gem as far as all-time shooters go. Allen Houston, now he wasn't a great all-around player, but he was a pretty solid player and at least worthy of an honorable mention. My last honorable mention is going to be Jalen Brunson, who is the current superstar of the Knicks. The only reason I got him on the outside as an honorable mention is because I think he needs a few more years under his belt before he could crack the top 5 Knicks of all time. Now, if he leads them to a championship run, either a finals appearance or a finals win, then Brunson's definitely hitting the top 5 for sure, sooner than later. But I feel like at most you need a few more years before he officially hits the top 5. So as of now, Brunson's an honorable mention. He's the superstar in this rebuild that's helped make the Knicks relevant again. At least worthy of an honorable mention for now. Like I said, a few years, maybe he's top 5. But with that being said, let's get into the top 5 itself. We're actually going to start number 5. We're going to go with Bernard King. No, actually, wait. We're going to go with Earl the Pearl Monroe. Earl Monroe, during his tenure with the Knicks, he was a 3-time All-Star. He was part of the he was a 2-time All-Star. He was a part of that championship squad. So he was a 2-time All-Star, part of that championship squad in the early 70s. He was a good teammate behind Walt Frazier and was, one of the better Knicks of all time. It's deservedly so. He was part of a glorious run for them. He helped lead the way to a championship squad alongside the great Walt Frazier. So, got to give him on that. He at least hits the top 5 for his role there. He's really one of the better players of the early 70s. Certainly a key contributor to that last Knicks championship win. And now we move on to number 4. That's going to be Bernard King. Now, Bernard King, he was a real key contributor to those mid-80s teams in the early Ewing years. Now, the Knicks weren't the greatest team in the NBA during that era, but Bernard King was certainly one of the top players of that era. He was the scoring champion for 1984-85 season. He also was a 3-time All-Star as well, and certainly one of the better Knicks players in franchise history, kind of during a down period in between the two booms, in between the Walt Frazier and the Patrick Ewing boom. And he played a role in that transition in helping you mold Ewing as a player. And, it's certainly one of the better. We remember Bernard King most for his run with the Knicks. Now, he was pretty good with the Nets, too, but I think he's mostly remembered for his run with the Knicks, especially in helping that rebuild. So he was a good offensive player, multi-time All-Star, and helped play a key role in the rebuild. So I got him at number 4. Now we get to number 3. We're going to go with the late Willis Reed. Now, Willis Reed was a key contributor to the early glory years of the Knicks. Like, he was during that 70s run. Willis Reed unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he was one of those early all-time great Knicks. Now, he's not the most remembered, but when you think New York Knicks franchise history, Willis Reed comes to mind. Alongside Walt Frazier. And was the part of that championship team in the early 70s. So there was another key contributor to those championship teams from the early 70s. And Willis Reed is remembered as one of those all-time great Knicks. 7-time All-Star, NBA champion, but he does get overshadowed by 2 more players. Number 2, some of you people might have him as your number 1, but he's my number 2. That's Walt Frazier. Now, he was the face of those championship runs ahead of Willis Reed. And we lost him last year, but Walt Frazier certainly not forgotten. Now, you're talking about Walt Frazier. He was he was also, I believe, a 7-time All-Star himself, if I'm not mistaken, but he was part of those NBA championship teams as well. With the Knicks, he was a 2-time champion, matter of fact. So Walt Frazier, yeah. His run wasn't as long as number 1 on this list, but he had a dominant run for the time it lasted. And he was part of the last championship win that the New York Knicks had. But you're thinking he'd probably be number 1 for that ring right there. But I'm actually not going to go with that. I'm going to go with Patrick Ewing as the number 1 guy. And here's why. Because Patrick Ewing had a longer run with the Knicks and had a longer overall history of dominance for the franchise. And now Patrick Ewing, he was there from 85-86 season till the early 2000s. Now Ewing did during that run period consistently keep the Knicks in playoff contention. They did get to 2 finals appearances, but they fell short in them. I feel like as an individual player, though, Ewing outshines Walt Frazier. I feel like Frazier was in a more favorable situation to win a championship during that era in the early 70s. This was before the Chicago Bulls, the Houston Rockets with Akeem Olajuwon, before all those guys. So no disrespect to Walt Frazier and his accomplishments with the New York Knicks, but I feel like Ewing was more dominant as a player and did so in a tougher era. So I rank Ewing in. So I'm basing this off individual merits. I feel like Patrick Ewing was more valuable individually for the Knicks, whereas Walt Frazier, with all due respect, was in a more favorable team situation to win. So with that, I'll go with Patrick Ewing as the greatest New York Knick of all time, one of those all-time centers, considered one of the standard bearers for all-time dominant big men. And, one of the faces of that era of elite big men alongside Hakeem Olajuwon, Shaquille O'Neal, Alonzo Mourning, Patrick Ewing, David Robinson. Like, you take out of those names, Ewing was the main guys during that era, particularly the late 80s era. We remember Hakeem and Ewing as the 2 most dominant bigs, and that carried over into the 90s. And Patrick Ewing consistently kept the Knicks in contention, led the way for 2 finals runs, and is revered as one of those all-time greats. But yeah, those are my top 5 New York Knicks. You guys comment, leave me your 5. And make sure to drop a like, subscribe to the channel for more content. Coming up next in this series, we're going to talk about the Oklahoma City Thunder. And for that, we're going to include their run as the OKC Thunder and Seattle Supersonics in that top 5 list. So stay tuned, and I'll catch you next time.